The War Piano. It was always right after Sunday supper, when the good dishes were washed, dried, and returned to the hall china closet, that Mama would turn to Josh and me and say, "Let's go downtown and see if it's still there." She'd then slip off her bibbed apron, tuck away her stubborn wisps of steamy hair, and after making certain the blackout curtain was drawn tight, but the front vestibule light was on low, the three of us would depart full of secret purpose for Main Street. The side streets were silent and dark that Sunday in 1942, as we walked the 6 long blocks to the center of town. The mood of our first wartime spring was somber and sad. The neighborhood gossip was filled with war rumors and fears that dampened even the normally carefree spirits of my brother and me. There were news reports of American defeats in the Pacific and frightening stories about the German occupation and its major successes in Europe. That unwelcome reality haunted our waking playtimes and intruded into our dreams at night. The huge Steinway grand piano sat strong in all its glory in the middle of the display window at Franklin's department store at the north end of Main Street. It was a magnificent instrument, made of dark red mahogany that had been hand-polished to a burnished glow. The ivory keys were perfectly matched, and their creamy white color contrasted strikingly with the rich cherry patina of its magnificent wooden case. "Isn't it beautiful?" Mama whispered. We watched her glance move slowly over the massive instrument, taking in every curve. Almost by sheer force of will, we believed she would pass through the glass partition somehow and be seated and playing. Her fingers tapped briskly on the store window pane as she silently played the melody that we knew danced in her head. "When can I take piano lessons?" I asked, as Josh fidgeted, now a bit bored. "I had a piano once, before Grandpa." Mama's voice cracked as she spoke. "I promised you both music lessons, but with the war and your father gone..." Her voice fell away, and she abruptly drew us away from the window. As we walked home through the now blacked-out neighborhoods, Josh danced ahead, playing hide-and-seek behind each shrub and front stoop. Without the glow of the street lamps, the dark shadows quickly enveloped him, and Mama had to call out every minute or so to remind him to stay in sight. She and I walked side by side, not speaking, her hand tightly in mine. The war had come suddenly, it seemed, then, although, looking back now, I guess there had been lots of warning signs. Names and places that Josh and I had never heard of flashed on the movie newsreels at our local theater and splashed across the front pages of all the newspapers. It was a Monday morning in late winter, however, that made me finally believe war was real. That was the day Father left. Father had enlisted right after Pearl Harbor and had come home on a brief leave before going overseas. He had volunteered for a dangerous assignment, we later learned. The morning he left, Mama went into their bedroom and sat in her wicker rocking chair and rocked. From then on, whenever the war became too much for her, she'd turn on the Zenith table radio and pass away the hours listening to whatever music came over the airwaves, seeking a different world that was safe and happier. We were still at the Park Street apartment then, but not long afterwards we moved. Grandpa arrived one afternoon on the train to New York City and announced that Father's service allotment could never support the three of us. We should move back home and live with him and Grandma in the ground-floor apartment in Grandma's apartment building upstate. There the whole family could share the hardships the war was bringing on everybody. So we moved, leaving behind the city and the coziness of our small second-floor Queens apartment to live in the dark, paneled labyrinths of Grandma's brick apartment house more than 200 miles north in mid-state New York. Josh and I soon learned to play cowboys and Indians in the long front hallway without getting caught, and beat each other at jacks on the wide parquet floors on the second and third-floor landings. In the evenings, we'd watch the tenants come and go from our secret vantage point just inside the French glass parlor doors that opened from Grandpa's apartment onto the long entrance hallway. On the surface, Mama adjusted, but her sense of privacy and independence, I could tell, had shattered. She existed for only Josh and me and the scarce letters from Father. Josh and I could make her laugh sometimes, and Father's letters briefly transported her back to the life they'd loved together in the big city. The entire apartment house was still when we entered after our walk that evening. Grandma and Grandpa were both listening to the Jack Benny show on the console radio in the living room. Grandma was sitting in her favorite chair next to the big bay window darning socks, and Grandpa was at his desk working on the rental accounts and slicing his evening apple with a fruit knife. "Been dreaming again, Francis?" Grandpa commented without glancing up from his accounts. "These are bad times for dreams. The war has taken dreams from all of us." Mama's forehead tightened, but she stubbornly helped Grandpa organize the accounts. "If the children could take music lessons, their minds might be off all this unpleasantness for a bit. You know I promised that to their father." I noticed that Grandma was busy darning socks in her favorite chair, but listening very carefully. She smiled softly and pulled her thread through the sock holes a bit more tightly. "You're still annoyed about my selling that piano, aren't you?" Grandpa was a man who believed in the practical and the necessary. "I sold it because the money was best used elsewhere. These times aren't easy with the Depression and now all the fighting and sacrifices." "Yes, I know. We have Hitler and the Nazis in Pearl Harbor and too much killing," Mama sighed. "But if I have to wait until we win this war, Josh and Mary will be too old to want piano lessons, and they won't know anything at all about how to make music." Josh and I listened quietly. This conversation took place every time we came home from our evening walk uptown. As a girl, Mama had studied piano with a fervor, never missing a chance to play wherever and whenever she could. She had a performer's love of music, even though she instinctively knew that her talent wasn't that of a professional. Grandpa felt such frivolities were foolishness. Only my father understood Mama's passionate attachment to her music. The two of them were never happier than when Father managed to find a friend with a piano so Mama could play for a few hours and dream about having a piano of her own again. When I entered Mama's room before bed that night, she was silent and rocking quietly. Glenn Miller's String of Pearls was coming over the Zenith radio on the side table. She hummed the melody softly to herself as she rocked. She had undone her hair and changed into her navy dressing gown. Her long, thick, chestnut hair fell to the middle of her back, making her look like a schoolgirl. "Tell me about that piano you said Grandpa sold," I asked. "That was my piano. Or at least, I thought it was. I played it for years growing up. When I married and moved away, I believed that piano would always be here waiting for me. After Grandpa sold it, your father said he'd get me a piano when he could. He wanted his children to love music like I do. He was saving to buy one when the war came." I picked up Mama's hairbrush and started brushing her hair in long, full, strong strokes. The radio started another selection, and the strains of "I'll Be Seeing You" drifted through the bedroom. "Music's my fantasy, a promise, Mary. It's my way to live for a bit, away from my fears about this war and where we have to live now. That piano in Franklin's department store is my dream that the world will be sane again someday, and our family can be together once more." Mama pulled me close and gave me a big, long hug. The days passed that year as days always do, lengthening into weeks as spring blended into summer. Mama, Josh, and I continued to stay in Grandpa's apartment house, trying to live out the war together. Grandpa kept comparing our lot to that of the soldiers now fighting on 2 fronts in Europe and Asia, and said we should feel thankful to have what we had and were safe. Mama still took us to gaze now and then at the wonderful piano in Franklin's department store window, but she stopped talking about piano lessons. As the days passed, that piano became a symbol of something longed for but never quite attained, similar to our continued hope for the end of the war and the return of Father. It was a Friday morning in fall when I arrived late for breakfast and found Mama intently reading the morning newspaper. Josh was diddling with his oatmeal as usual. There hadn't been extra sugar for months, and Josh despised unsweetened hot cereal. As Grandma handed me my bowl, I noticed Mama was eagerly scribbling something on a pad of paper. "Mary, I'll be going out later today. Don't look for me after school. Can you walk Josh home?" "Where will you be?" "Helping the war effort, for once. Now, be off. You'll be late." Mama absent-mindedly kissed Josh and me goodbye and excused herself. Any further details about that afternoon's excursion I realized were going to be left to my imagination and my private detective work. I opened the paper to the page Mama had been reading and then folded so carefully next to her plate. At the bottom, I saw the ad. Musicians needed. 4 p.m. today, Franklin's department store. Come join us. The hours at school that day moved at an agonizingly slow pace, just like the line at the movie theater did before the matinees on Saturdays. Not even recess could keep me from wondering about Mama's plans. What was Mama up to, anyway? She wasn't the least bit involved with the war effort. Not the scrap tire drives, not the Civil Defense Committee meetings, not even the collection of silk stockings taken up from all the ladies in town. It was all too painful for her. The war was her private prison sentence to be served patiently and silently and alone. So what was happening? The town clock chimed 4:15 as I ran down the school steps and headed uptown with Josh reluctantly in tow. There was no time to walk Josh home now. He'd just have to stay up with me. As we neared the center of town, I could see a crowd standing outside Franklin's department store. Then my heart stopped. The melodious tones of a grand piano were drifting across the square. With Josh still at my heels, I crossed Main Street and slipped into the rear of the crowd, growing ever larger. It was then I recognized the clear, syncopated notes of "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree." I pushed and shoved Josh and myself between bodies taller and bigger until we were in the front row, scrunched tightly against the glass of the display window, and I saw Mama. She was sitting in the window, playing the Steinway mahogany piano she'd longed to have for so many months. 3 musicians were playing in the store window with Mama. On one side was Mr. Barstow plucking a bass fiddle. I recognized him as the new store clerk at Franklin's. Everyone in town knew he was 4F. On the other side, playing his saxophone heartily, stood old Mr. Donaldson, the butcher from the corner meat market. At the rear of the window that was now a stage, frowning and looking like he needed more room for his drum set, was Mr. Fisher, my grade school principal. 2 loudspeakers had been rigged from inside to the outside of the store, and leaning against the big plate glass window was a poster that read, "Give to your service canteen. Support our boys overseas." Next to that sign was a big barrel with a slotted cover for donations. Josh and I stood hand in hand, our noses pressed tightly against the cold, clear glass. This wasn't the wife and mother who lived in Grandpa's apartment house trying to stay sane and survive the prison that had become her private war. This was a very different person, doing what she most loved in all the world. Now I understood why Mama had clung to her dream of a piano during the first long, frightening, and lonely months without Father. The concert lasted half an hour. Josh and I stayed in the front row and watched. After the last remarkable note resounded out onto the street, Mama looked up from the keyboard and saw us. She smiled and motioned for us to come inside the store and then into the store window, pointing to the small, low doorway by the store entrance that opened onto the display stage. It was very odd, standing inside a store display window and looking out instead of looking in. And Josh and I stood shyly next to the big grand piano, wondering what was going to happen next. Mama didn't seem at all embarrassed. She just chatted with the musicians as they packed up their instruments and music and left. The display window was soon empty, except for Mama, Josh, and me. She sat back down at the piano and ran her fingers over the keyboard, producing a ripple of light and delicate arpeggios. "Josh and Mary, you're going to get piano lessons. Every Friday. It's all arranged. Mr. Franklin says I can teach you both right here on this wonderful piano in exchange for my playing at his USO benefits. We're going to have our first lesson right now." So we did have our first lesson right there and then, that day in the window of Franklin's department store. We had our lesson with Mama, talking nonstop about all the notes and melody and techniques and the wonder of making music. That lesson must have lasted a long time, for when I finally looked up, dusk was creeping into the store window, and Mama's long, thin fingers were disappearing into the darkness. Still, she continued to play. She had no need for light. For her, the music could go on forever. Finally, she stopped, her passion stilled for the moment. She reached out and embraced Josh and me. It was then I looked over her shoulder and saw Grandpa standing outside the window, hands buried in the pockets of his old brown tweed sports jacket. He looked as though he'd been watching us for a long time. However, when Mama saw him and tried to meet his gaze, he just nodded, turned, and walked away. When we got home, Grandma had dinner waiting in the oven. The smell of macaroni and cheese and fresh green beans cooked with onions floated out into the dining room through the swinging kitchen door. Grandpa was already there, sitting at the head of the table, going over his accounts as always, and waiting for dinner to be served. Josh and I washed our hands quickly and sat down without saying a word. I wondered how Grandpa was going to react to the events of that afternoon. "I guess you finally found a piano, didn't you, Francis?" Grandpa's voice sounded a bit too loud in the silent dining room. Mama just sat down and helped herself to a few spoonfuls of the steamy macaroni. "I found an instrument the children and I can borrow, that's all. And I found a way to give them lessons even without my own piano." "You always find a way to get what you want, don't you, Francis?" Grandpa paused, a forkful of beans pointedly still in midair. "Even if you have to use the war to get it." He then stubbornly put the beans in his mouth. "And that's a good thing, my dear husband," Grandma suddenly interrupted. "It's good to find a moment to forget bad, especially the bad that this unfortunate war has brought on all of us." Grandma always had a way of saying things that made the world right and true, and this time was no different. She set the rest of our dinner down very pointedly at the center of the table. "I hope you enjoy your dinners. I cooked something special for everyone tonight. Maybe we can enjoy a bit of peace, at least until dinner's over?" Accordingly, Grandpa went silent the rest of dinner and didn't mention the piano again. As early evening deepened into night, Mama led Josh and me out into the long paneled hallway that ran the length of Grandpa's apartment on the first floor. It was getting chilly in the house now. Grandpa had already gone and banked down the coal furnace for the night to save fuel, and the enclosed front hall kept the heat for a while. Mama motioned for both of us to sit down on the first 2 steps that led up to the second-floor landing and beyond to the other apartments high above. "Is Grandpa angry about our piano lessons, Mama?" Josh asked. "No, dear child. It's just hard for him to understand dreams. Your grandfather's not a frivolous man. It's one of his finest strengths, I've learned." She smiled ironically and yet a bit sadly. The 3 of us sat together on the hall stairs for a bit, not saying much, just each of us remembering the piano lesson in the department store window that afternoon in our own way. The hallway was silent and dark. Nobody went out late anymore. The streets were empty from the blackouts and always lonely, just like we were. The soft lamplight from the wall sconces shone dimly across the hall, reflecting our sudden pensive mood. I, for one, was glad Mama had played her music for us in the window. I was glad she was going to give Josh and me piano lessons. Learning to play the piano in a store window was exciting and different, and now, all of a sudden, Mama was exciting and different, too. The mantel clock in Grandpa's living room struck the hour. Mama moved to get up. It was bedtime. It was then that the French glass parlor doors opened and Grandpa stepped out into the hall. He had a large box under his arm. The box had faded yellow daffodils painted on the cover and heavy black printing. "If you're going to teach these children to play piano, you'd better do it right." Grandpa handed the box to Mama. "No point in wasting these." Mama looked at the box and then at Grandpa. Without a word, she untied the string that was knotted tightly around the breadth of the box and lifted the cover. Inside was folder after folder filled with all kinds of sheet music. "I always did think you played a pretty tune, Francis. I guess I never told you enough. Not as often as I should have, at least. I kept these. Maybe you can use them now and put them to happy use during these terrible, tough times." Mama smiled, her eyes soft and warm. She clutched the tattered box and then reached out and kissed Grandpa on the cheek. For that one brief moment, the war was very far away. I looked at Josh and Mom and my grandpa and remembered Grandma's wise words earlier. I wanted others who were struggling with the war here and overseas to enjoy beautiful melodies for a moment too, perhaps from a similar beautiful piano or something else they loved, and feel the same moments of happiness we'd felt. I wanted others to discover their own special melody of love and hope, like the melody we had been given that day, while listening to our mother play the war music, and then having our piano lesson in a store window. She had played for us, to inspire the world to return to living life and loving that life. I wanted others to receive that same beautiful, amazing music about strength and love, and that same hope for the future that we had received this day, this year, in these terrible times. For one brief moment, the war was far away. Josh and I both did learn to play the piano from Mom's teaching in the store window, and when the war finally did end, we continued playing, and still do. I've looked back many times since and realized that solace never comes easily during hard or dangerous times. But if you have a family that cares and works hard, you can and will survive anything. You have to find that special solace in the worst of times. It will let you stand strong for life, family, love, freedom, and honor. My grandparents and Mom are now gone, but their visions remain with me for how to persevere bravery and experience unique moments of love and beauty together even in the worst of times. It's a lesson I'm now passing on to my children, along with my long love of music, so they can keep what they love firm no matter what's ahead for them or when it appears. I received that strength from Mom and her special gift of music, given with absolute love in a department store window those many years ago.